Useful observation that I've made before talking to non-Christians is how non-Christians make Christian assumptions. And often they will criticize the Bible and what we believe as Christians using what they don't realize are Christian assumptions. And a number of Christian writers have pointed this out. So some of you may have heard of is Glenn Scrivener, and there's lots of others who've done it. And some non-Christian writers, interestingly, have done this, the best known being Tom Holland. And they all make the same point, particularly about human rights. If you took any one of us here and you cut us up and looked inside, you will not find human rights. Human rights is not a scientific matter. It's not something that's in our biology, in our DNA. Where do we get the idea from? It's not in nature. It's actually not in history. It's a unique moment that they came into being. It derives from the history of the church. In fact, Tom Holland, like I said, isn't actually a Christian yet. He says, if you say someone has human rights, you may as well say that Jesus rose from the dead and is ascended and sits at the Father's right hand. Because without that, human rights doesn't make sense. So anyway, that's something for you to think about. Next time someone says something like that, say, well, that sounded a bit Christian. You may as well say Jesus ascended and reigns at the Father's right side. I want to suggest that actually rights aren't in the Bible. But something more powerful and more radical is. And that's our responsibility to each other. It's not my rights, but my responsibility to you and yours to me. Now that's where actually rights end up coming from. But it comes with what is our responsibility to the other. Not what are my rights from you, but my responsibilities to you. And specifically, these are responsibilities that are ordered by Jesus Christ. And these responsibilities turn the whole world upside down. They change how we see others, and they have changed world history until we think it's just normal. And this passage, obviously, is one of the passages where we get this from. And we're looking about relationships and some specific relationships. Before we dive in, though, what I want to do is to set us in the context of Ephesians. So we've been looking at Ephesians for a little while now, on and off. And what is it about? And where does this fit in? So Ephesians, a few people have said before that Ephesians is a book about spiritual warfare. And that's probably right. And I've summed it up like this before, and James said something similar. I can't remember exactly what James said last week, but it's pretty similar to this, which is in Ephesians, it's about God demonstrates his wisdom to the spiritual realm and the world in the church. Okay? God demonstrates his wisdom and his power to the spiritual realm and the world in all places in the church. Now that sounds like a weird place to show your wisdom, God's wisdom and spiritual power in the church. How does he do it? Why does he do it there? Because the way he does it is by uniting a divided and fallen humanity to Christ and therefore to each other. And so just even in an evening service like this, you look around the room and there's a bunch of us together who probably shouldn't be together. But we have been saved and united to Christ and therefore to each other. And that's how God demonstrates his wisdom and power to the angels, to the demons, to the world. That's chapters 1 to 3. Now, it took James and Mikey a lot longer to say it for some reason, but that's chapters 1 to 3 of Ephesians. So the spiritual warfare bit then is where that's applied. That what God has done in chapters 1 to 3, where's that seen? Where's this spiritual warfare battle? It is the battleground of human relationships. That's chapter 4 to the end of the book. So relationships in the church, relationships in society, how we treat people, how we treat each other. And chapter 5, verse 22 to the end of the book, we're dealing with some specific relationships. And then we'll notice next week we have the armor of God and how we relate to non-Christians. So you have these specific, the household relationships, armor of God, how we engage with the world. So this is just a straightforward follow-on from what James looked at last week. And James pointed out that actually verse 21 comes before verse 22. Verse 21, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So the church and everyone in the church submits to each other. But we do so asymmetrically. It's not all the same. It depends on the roles that we're in. But each person has responsibility to another. And so we saw this last week. So last week was that passage about wives submitting, and we saw the word there is a voluntary submission. It's submission, but it's voluntary. It is actually the same word of the son submitting to the father. Now it causes our hackles to go up, but then James took us to look at how the teaching of husbands is quite hard-hitting. The demand on them is they are to be like Christ, that they are to love their wives in the way that Christ loved his wife, the bride, his church, by dying. Husbands are to die for their wives, for their good. So rather than what is the benefit of my position, it's how do I die to serve this person? And the same in the passage we've got this evening. In fact, even more so, because here there's no voluntary submission. They're told, obey. Children to parents and servants to masters is obey. And more obviously here we're talking about a subordinate relationship. But again, the responsibility is, and the burden is on the one, to use it for want of a better term, the one over. So like last week, it's not revolutionary in the sense of overturning the status quo. Let's rise up and so on, like some worldviews do, but it's no less radical. Because leaders still lead, but they serve and sacrifice. And some of these ideas are going to come up in the mornings when we look at Mark's Gospel. Something that struck me as well is that for want of a better phrase, junior in each partnership is addressed and is addressed first. That just wouldn't have happened in the time that Paul is writing. So this is quite jarring stuff for the first readers. Now, I prepared this talk earlier on in the week, and then what we've been doing in Impact is we've been thinking about difficult questions. And so I say to the group, what do you want to tackle this week? And so one of them said, let's deal with slavery in the Bible and what people fire at that. So that's what we've been doing. So that I prepared afterwards. And then after doing all of that, I then read this little book and I commend it to you. And so I prepared my sermon, but other stuff might happen as I go along. So this is called The New Testament as Slavery, Approaches and Implications. And basically what the guy is writing about is how people often just talk about how slavery is in the Bible. We don't think slavery is a good idea. Therefore, all other relationships have changed. So people have used that to sort of unpick stuff about husbands and wives, stuff about marriage and homosexuality, and even now children and parents. And he's showing how the things sort of line up. So that's quite a helpful book about what the Bible actually says about slavery and doesn't say. And so I commend that to you. And it does relate to some of what I'm about to talk about. So in front of us now, we've got two relationships, parents and children, and servants and masters. And Paul addresses both sides of those equations. So firstly, parents and children in verses 1 to 4. And the first of those he addresses are children. That's in verses 1 to 3. So notice children are to obey. How are they to obey? In the Lord. So their first allegiance is to the Lord. One way we show allegiance is obey parents. So children here. So I can see a couple that now sort of hiding under the desks. If you want to show you love Jesus, you do what mum and dad say. Simples. Now, Paul quotes here from the Ten Commandments. It's the fifth commandment. Obey. Who do you obey? Is it mum or dad? It says mum and dad, not just one. And it's a commandment with a promise. So you look at verse 3. The promise, it says, verse 2, the first commandment with a promise. Verse 3, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Now, the Old Testament says the land. Here the word can mean land or can mean the earth. But the point is that it's good. It's good for you to do this. It's good for parents and it's good for children. And it's good for society generally. Things just work better when you do what God says. Now, who do we mean by children? What's the definition of a child? So the Old Testament, I've mentioned this before, you get in the Ten Commandments a command, then it's sort of unpacked later on in the law. So how does it get unpacked in the Old Testament? Well, children can be children in the house, and they can be grown up and married and in another home. So to children, what we might say school age, is talking about obedience. Do as your parents ask, as fallen as they are. The grown-up children, perhaps they've gone up and got married themselves and had children, they still have a responsibility to their parents, which is respect and honour. And that often includes a degree of care for them. So you don't actually outgrow this commandment. But how you live it out depends on the age stage that you're at and your parents are at. As you get older, the nature of the relationship will change. So Christian children obey mum and dad. It's a practical way to love Jesus, and it's the best for you. Other side is dads, verse 4. So verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now that's not what you expect, is it? Because these relationships address one half of the relationship and then the other. So we just said children to mum and dad, but now it's children, it's dads to children, just dads, not mums. Why? Well, notice there's a negative and a positive aspect that's commanded of the dads. So negative, don't provoke. Now, I'm pretty sure I could say to mums here, don't provoke your children as well. Mums should not provoke. I don't think a mum can read Ephesians 6 and go, it's all right for mums to provoke children. But I think it is that it seems to be more applicable to dads, doesn't it? That dads need to hear this more. We tend to be more playful and silly and wind up and provoke. That's one of our problems. Also, I think dads can be harder, more heavy-handed. I know people who've grown up in the faith and then given up because their dad was overbearing. I know a minister, and he's a minister. He's still going on with the Lord. But just by the grace of God, his dad, who was also a minister, used to beat him if he didn't want to go to the evening service and things like that. And this is exactly what Paul's saying, don't be like. He tried to sort of beat the faith into him, rather to be gentle. More of that soon. Positively, end of verse 4. But bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Again, you could say, well, why not mums? Well, yeah, absolutely. But it seems to me, and this is a generalization, but mums don't need to be told. Women often appear more spiritually awake and mature than men. And men sometimes need a bit of encouragement. So dads need to step up. Just as we saw last week, that the husband is to die to himself for his wife, to present her holy, to make sure she's going on with the Lord. So dads take responsibility for their kids' spiritual development. The church, we're here to support that, to equip each other. We've got groups for kids and teens targeted at them, so the teaching's aimed at them and they're with their peers and that sort of thing. But that's not a substitution for dads. It's alongside dads. And of course, in Scripture, there's people like Lydia, mums who have to do this solo. So we can, as parents, make legitimate delegations to schools and clubs and church groups, but we want to it's the dad's job to make sure they're doing this for their kids' goods, because God has entrusted them to you to care for their well-being. But what if the mum knows more and is more spiritual, which is often the case? Well, first she set the bar. This is what you need to aim for. But also it just means take the lead. Family worship. Okay, kids, let's worship God together. Mum's going to tell us about something or other. Something like that. So positively, dads are to teach and enable, encourage and lead and set an example. I'll give you an example about how I accidentally did this. I was accidentally a good example as a dad. So from when Shah was a baby, we used to read the Bible and prayed with him and encouraged him as he got a bit older to do some of this himself. And sometimes he did. And I used to, because I'm a minister and I get paid to be a minister, I used to think, let's be very professional to make sure I actually spend time with the Lord. So I sort of viewed my time with the Lord as being like a line management meeting. So I'd get to my desk and I'd read the Bible and pray before I did anything else. So meeting with my boss. And then I can't remember why I started doing this, but I started to do that in the lounge. And without suggesting it, Josiah just started reading the Bible and praying. And I've heard similar things from other men, that kids, especially boys, copy their dads. And they copy their dads for better and for worse. It wasn't deliberate on my point, but it just shows how powerful example is and why we do that. So notice this relationship is asymmetrical, but it's not as some ancient household codes were. It's not parents, particularly dads. This is how you benefit from your children. But serving, how dads serve their children firmly but gently, kindly, directing them by good example, kids obeying. Just like we thought of last week, that Jesus doesn't beat his wife into submission. He loves his wife into submission. It's leading for their good and leading through sacrifice. Secondly is servants and masters in verses 5 to 9. Now, first notice that the ESV, the version we're using, uses the phrase bondservant, and there's a bit in the preface about why they translate some things the way they do. Other versions, I think the NIV has slave, some use servant. That's quite a complex issue. Read this and I won't explain it all now. But what Paul is talking about here is not quite the same as the transatlantic slave trade, although there were massive abuses in the first century. Some slaves owned slaves. Slaves often became free. Probably any profession here, just looking around the room, I think there would be slaves doing your job at that time. But he's not quite talking about employees as we know it. I suppose if we go back 100 years, even some people less, the way labour worked here, we didn't have rights and so on. The Bible has its very anti-slavery verses. The Old Testament provision for slavery is this temporary situation. It's very different again. But what about what we have in front of us here? The passage here is very practical. That just given our fallen world, how should we live in it? So it's clear from what else Paul writes elsewhere that slavery is a bad condition. Get out of it if you can. Slaving is evil. But to the person find themselves in slavery, he's saying this is how you are to live now. And it may be a surprise to us in 2026 that Paul doesn't say rise up against your oppressor. Yet again, it's not revolutionary, but it is radical. And it's actually the teaching here is what brought slavery down in the early centuries of the church. And it's still, I think, relevant to us, because if this is true to a slave and a bondservant, then how much true is it for us now with workers' rights? So the first side of the equation is servants to masters, verses 5 to 8. Again, as with wives and as with kids, it is as to the Lord. Obey as to the Lord, as to Christ. That you're seeing Christ in your boss. Not only so, but showing respect. Now, I think that is, my employment situation is unusual, but thinking back to when I worked in more conventional situations, it's challenging to respect a boss who isn't always respectable or competent. But we see why here in verse 5. There's a word play here. The word masters is actually the word we normally translate Lord or lords. So obeying your earthly lords to obey your heavenly Lord, Christ. When and how are you to do this? Verses 8 and 9. Not just when you're seen, but when, and they know that you're doing it, so you get the credit, but when you're not seen, and there's no credit coming because they're not quite sure who did the work. Because God sees what you do, and he's pleased, and he rewards it. More here, perhaps, than with wife and husbands and kids and parents, is the assumption here is that not all bosses are good and reasonable. So when this was first, you can imagine being in the Ephesian church and this being read, and obviously there'd be husbands and wives and children and parents, and there'd be slaves and there'd be masters. But of course, some of the slaves would not have had their masters there. So it's not just about for Christian masters, it's whatever master you might have. But we work as we do because our work is part of our worship to Christ. So yes, this is a worship service, a sort of focal point of worship in the week, but all our work is our worship. All our work is for the Lord. We work for our lords because we work for the Lord. Now, there's a classification that's not mentioned here, but didn't exist as such. But thinking, I think you could extend this to school, to university, or other things that we do that aren't conventional work, but we do it diligently because it's part of our worship, and not just when someone's breathing down our neck to do it. So that's servants to masters, but then masters to servants in verse 9. Masters, do the same thing to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. Notice again that this is not a revolution. There is here an order and a hierarchy, but it's radically different. It's not the status quo. So some people will want to just say, right, we just have a hierarchy. And some people, right, we want to overturn all hierarchy. No, there's a hierarchy, but a radically different way of taking responsibility for and to each other. So there's still a master-servant relationship, but a radical way that the master now sees things. Notice the same to them. He is the same to them. And he's to stop threatening. So if you have staff or someone who's junior to you in your workplace or in other situations, to be treated as if they're worth something, to be treated as you want to be treated, in respect. This is why I said that this is more radical than human rights. Now, human rights trace their idea to the church and to church history and to Christianity, and it's kind of arisen out of this, but it starts not with, look, you owe me this, but I'm going to give you that. This is the respect I'm going to give you as my boss, or this is the respect I'm going to give you as my employee. But this is where it starts, not as the servant that has rights, because he doesn't have rights here. Paul's writing at a time when there were no legal codes and trade unions and things like that. Old Testament slavery had some of that, but this isn't what he's talking about. These are Roman slaves with almost no rights. But the Christian master, the Christian Lord, respects them as equals. They have the same worth before God as he does. They might have a different role. They're still a boss, they're still a worker, but they're still humans, God's image bearers. And I think it's the same for other situations we find ourselves in. So when we're in a shop, the person in the shop or the restaurant serves us. It's what they're meant to do. But we can be nice to them. And someone comes around to fix something. And Glad's stepdad used to fit fireplaces. And I worked with him one day. Observation is that they all call him Ron, whilst wanting to be called Mr. Moore or whatever it is. No, we treat each other the same, don't we? I noticed this when I was at theological college. In my church was a builder, and he gave me a summer job. and he got me tiling someone's bathroom. So he taught me how to do it, and I've forgotten how to do it now. But I was tiling someone's bathroom, and the person, I didn't mind, but the person wasn't necessarily very polite to me. And then the guy from church introduced me to him and said, "Oh, have you spoken to Darren? He's training to be a minister." And at this point, the man sort of went, "Ooh." And suddenly I had all this respect as a future minister, then panicked that I was the one tiling his bathroom. And I thought then, well, what difference does it make if I'm a tiler or a minister? I'm just a bloke. We all deserve respect. It's not complicated, is it? But we like the idea of I'm over this person. We don't demand respect from people, but we give respect to people. And then generally that we get it back. And so he says not to threaten to get results. So the master is the master, or to use the actual word here, he's the Lord. He's in charge, but he's gentle. He doesn't overbear. Why? Because, end of verse 9, he's mindful that the master, the Lord, is over you. Whether you're a husband or a parent or a boss, elsewhere in the Bible, it's applied to kings, and I guess by extension, prime ministers and others. They're just middle management. They're under Christ's imperial majesty. And so the difference between a Christian and any of those and a non-Christian is the Christian sees the reality that there's a king who is over him. And I suppose if you're in the junior part of the relationship, if that's the right word, you see that there is a king above your Lord. And if you're the Lord over people, there's a king over you who you have to be accountable for how you treat others. As Christians, we don't stand on our rights. I'm in charge, I deserve this. Rather, we serve and we honour the other, whoever the other is. When we don't want to, when they don't deserve it, when I could get my own way because of my power, and frankly, I don't have to be nice about it. That's not the Christian way. I said this the other week, that with the Ten Commandments, when you go into the law, it breaks it up and expands it more. And in the Westminster Shorter Catechism and the Larger Catechism, there's a section on the Ten Commandments that's well worth a read. And they talk about the duties we have to those who are above us, the duties we have to those equal to us, and the duty to those who work under us. All of these people we have duties to, and we honour and we respect them because there's someone above all of us. And as James said last week, so Jesus is both the picture of perfect submission and perfect leadership. Jesus is the picture of perfect submission as he submits to his Father and as he submits to the authorities that went on to kill him. But Jesus is also the picture of authority over all, and yet he uses his power to serve others. So the one of ultimate universal authority serves to the point of death, and his death paying our ransom price, the price that redeems slaves to sin and death. So let's wrap some of this up. Human rights rises out of Scripture, rises out of Christian culture, but there's something from it that's far more powerful than rights. The example of Christ in how we treat others, those above us, beside us, below us. Christians are not revolutionary, but we are radical. Revolutionaries want to ditch all hierarchy, especially in the home, even of parents, often in cross-rider society, and ironically, revolutionaries are the most authoritarian. Every kind of revolutionary regime, whether it's in an organisation or in a country, have to be ridiculously authoritarian. Christians are not revolutionary in that we recognise people have different roles in the family, in work, in society. But we're not to lord over people for personal gain either. The way we relate to the family, to the church, to the world is unique because it's radical and it's across all relationships. And this is spiritual warfare. This is the battleground that all the battles that we read about in heaven are fought out in this area, in relationships. To serve Christ in how you are led and to serve Christ in how you lead. We all have different roles. We're all meant to be respected, and we're all to respect in all different forms of service. Have you ever had someone, sorry, just popped into my mind, but this happened to me a number of times. When you meet someone first time in church, what do? And they say, I'm only a. And then they're menial job in their eyes. No, I'm very glad you do it. The Christian leads by serving and serves by leading sometimes, as we live by dying. This is our ongoing worship. This is the battleground of relationships where spiritual warfare is fought. Let's pray.